Thank you, and it's like a perfect segue into my conversation, and we didn't even plan that, so that's awesome. First, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude for being on a panel with all these amazing activists, so I'm really excited for this. So, as the BDS movement is evolving and gaining momentum, we can see that our opposition is grasping for any chance to slow us down. And through my experience, that has been through normalizing and normalization. One aspect of organizing that I found to be very beautiful and inspiring is the diversity of this movement. And I don't mean that in a university catalog kind of way. I sincerely mean that. Especially in the DC metropolitan area, a majority of the SJP members that we have are not Arabs. And that's both a great thing and upsetting for a variety of reasons. But I don't think normalizing is exclusive to the Arab community. So for this discussion, I'd like to extend it to student organizing specifically, whether they have Arab members or not. Now, anti-normalization as a strategy and tactic has been integral to our success at Mason. But from my experience, it is highly misunderstood. And I think adhering to that strategy will help us facilitate divestment campaigns on universities with established or budding SJPs. So, when I first came to Mason in 2011, there wasn't a visible presence of solidarity, Palestinian solidarity, despite our large Muslim and Arab population. But there was definitely a very proud Zionist presence, even though it's such a minority at Mason. And when I finally did encounter a Palestinian presence, it was always accompanied by an Israeli one. So for this reason, we had to start Students Against Israeli Apartheid at George Mason. And with that, I'll just start getting into this. So we're going to talk about what it means to normalize something and how anti-normalization can empower us in our struggle for freedom. Again, anti-normalization is a strategy within the BDS framework. So for the purposes of today's discussion, let's think of boycotting and not normalizing as something that would be kind of one and the same. PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott, of Israel, has done great work towards conceptualizing the framework of anti-normalization. And we refer to it as a colonization of the mind. Okay, so normalizing is a colonization of the mind, where the oppressed come to believe that the reality that they are subjected to is the only normal reality that they must subscribe to, and that oppression is in fact a fact of life that must be coped with. And PACB has defined normalization as the participation in any event, initiative, or activity in Palestine or internationally that aims to bring together Palestinians and/or Arabs and Israelis, whether they be people or institutions, without placing as its goal resistance to and exposure of the Israeli occupation and all forms of discrimination and oppression against the Palestinian people. We can see that in PACB's definition, they refer to institutions, so it's justified in assuming that we can extend this to SJP as an organization. Now, before I introduce the strategy of normalization, I just want to preface this discussion. I know many of us are probably familiar with this, but this does not discriminate against individuals, but it targets institutions that attempt to normalize the occupation. So that doesn't mean that you can't work with Israelis or Jews like many people try to misconstrue. That being said, individuals who are complacent or complicit with organizations and institutions that strive to undermine the self-determination of Palestinians are not protected from being sanctioned. So that individual can be sanctioned if they are trying to propagate that. Now, to help us better understand this concept, we're going to work within two frameworks, which is coexistence, which we've heard a little bit about, and then co-resisting. Coexisting would be to normalize, and then co-resisting would be to challenge the discriminatory policies of Israel's regime. Now, many of us, unfortunately, are familiar with the notion of coexistence. The majority of the world has been deceived into believing that the problem that lies between Palestinians and Israelis lies in an inability to coexist, where in fact we, of course, know that this is false. And many normalizing projects are often centered around this idea of peace and understanding and showing that we're just not so different after all. But they completely ignore the ongoing occupation and colonization of Palestine. Analogous to the non-peace process, the subject matter of these dialogues are often limited. We can't talk about Nakba, settlements, the occupation. It's all considered too political. And so it's very important that we understand this framework. Excuse me. It's Ramadan right now, and I was worried during this panel that I was going to get horrible dry mouth and not be able to, speak. but I guess like we're all over, arguing over the moon sighting. So never mind, I won't digress. But I can drink the water today. Okay, so any project or activity that does not begin with the shared principles of resisting Israel's oppression of Palestinians only serves to further perpetuate the notion that we can continue to live under oppressive conditions prior to or leading to the end of occupation. So what would a project like this look like? I'm sure many of us have been invited to dialogues where we would go and discuss each other's narratives and eat hummus and learn to overcome our differences. That is exactly what a normalizing project would look like. But it doesn't have to be so obvious. They can take shape in movie screenings with organizations such as J Street, Hillel. On our campus, it's Israel Student Association. It might be Israel Alliance, any Zionist organization. Perhaps the most insidious event I've seen was at Mason when the ISA wanted to do a fundraiser for Syria, and they invited RSJP, they invited the Arab Student Association, and they invited the Muslim Student Association. And alhamdulillah, we put a stop to that and we did our own. But you can see how they tried to cut us out of the circle because our organization refuses to normalize. So these projects are already harmful and already dismiss the Palestinian narrative, right? Even when Palestinians are present, but when there's their absence, the effects of normalizing are exacerbated. We end up creating this bubble that marginalizes anyone who refuses to partake in such activities. Again, for instance, at George Mason, our Arab and SJP, that community in general, was very inclusive of our Zionist adversaries. So when a group of us rejected this notion of including racists and Zionists, we were labeled as radicals, and not in the connotation that people here would appreciate. So now we're developing this culture of resistance on our campus using anti-normalization and BDS. And within that, we need to make sure that, while we're resisting within our boundaries, that we don't limit or dictate the means in which others resist. The last thing we need is another Oslo situation that restructures the resistance movement. We don't want to start exchanging words like liberation with negotiation and, justice for peace. So now what does it mean to co-resist? Co-resist conversely begins with the commitment to resist Israel's oppression and recognizes the necessity of the fulfillment of the BDS call. But in essence, basically, any event that morally or politically equates the oppressor and oppressed, presenting the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis as symmetrical, should be boycotted. Now that we have an understanding of the framework in which we function, I'm going to move on to some of the more adverse effects of normalizing and how anti-normalization can empower our movement. So first, it creates a facade of equals. First and foremost, the normalizing's most detrimental effect is its ability to create a false parity amongst the two sides, further perpetuating the notion that Palestinians and Israelis are equals with petty differences over land and religion. We hear this often. We must show the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis for what it really is, one of oppressor and oppressed, and colonizer and colonized. I have yet to come across any photographs of white Afrikaners and black South Africans, linking arms as they exploited them for labor. Yet to see the Algerians and the French just hanging out, But many university administration doesn't see our relationship as one of being oppressed and oppressor, which may be one of the reasons students feel compelled, especially when they're not Palestinian, to capitulate to the demands of the administration, which are for organizations to have good relations, host joint events, and the worst thing, to keep perspectives balanced. Again, an effect of normalization. And because we are focusing on an organization with a collection of sundry identities, it may be difficult for solidarity activists who look more like the people they are resisting than those who they are in struggle with to reject the university's intimidation and invitations to dialogues. But next time the university administration just doesn't get this notion, just ask them if they require the same balance between the college Republicans or the college Democrats, the pro-choice and the anti-choice organizations. You don't see that same, requirement of cooperation. Even campus ISOs. Has anyone been invited to speak with the, future capitalists of the investment club? Right? One of the critiques I often hear is, and unfortunately this is by Palestinians, Tareq, How will we know what they want, and how will we convince them if we don't engage in dialogue? Firstly, this logic is exemplary of the effects of normalization. It allows us to assume that, in fact, we are equals with the ability to negotiate our demands. The power dynamic is completely skewed. Additionally, when people perceive our organizations as equals, it only serves Israel because it strips the Palestinians of their bargaining power. No longer are we an oppressed people with demands, but we are two people with equal grievances amongst each other. As the disparity amongst us diminishes, so does the magnitude of our demands. Next, it eases the mind of the oppressor and puts blame on the oppressed when we normalize. Not only do you legitimize the Israeli regime's right to exist when you normalize, but you also inadvertently ease the mind of the oppressor. You allow them to believe there's a human cost on both sides while forgetting the reason that anything bad would happen to them is a symptom of their own actions. Someone recently, this is the most ridiculous probably, someone recently tried to have me sympathize for IDF soldiers who suffer from PTSD, completely ignoring the fact that a majority of children in Gaza suffer from PTSD as a result of those very soldiers' actions. Here we are opening the door for the oppressor to be the oppressed. We play an audience to what is and isn't legitimate resistance. We give them a platform to cover up 66 years of ethnic cleansing with a critique of a symptom of their own occupation. We must never allow our oppressor to forget their identity, and that which is that of a colonizer. When you engage in normalization, you either ignore the discriminatory policies that Israel enjoys or accept them as the status quo that can be lived with. You accept a two-tier system of rights based on the supremacy due to one's religion. You strip your brothers and sisters in struggle of the right to return. You say yes to checkpoints, a fake history, and a denial of the crimes committed against them and their families. You say yes to a future as oppressive as our present. Well, I say no, and I'm not alone. It's difficult for some of our generation to understand this concept because we are the post-Oslo generation. We have only been invited to speak of our plight in this issue, if we want to call it that, through the framework of Israel being hand in hand our partner in peace rather than the oppressive foot that is keeping us down. Ghassan Kanafani, Allah yarhamu, before he was killed by the Mossad, used to say, he is wrong who says that we are the generation of revolution. Rather, we are the generation who will give it life. And we are that generation. Anti-normalization empowers us with the ability to rise above. No longer does the oppressor have a say in their future. Before Palestinians can finally have the right to self-determination, and I don't mean the kind that Obama and Netanyahu are offering us, we must strip Israel of its colonial privilege and expose it for the undemocratic racist state that it has always been. Anti-normalization empowers us with the ability to change the power dynamic. We refocus on what is and isn't truly realistic. For us to believe that it is realistic to convince our colonizers to shed their colonial privileges is ludicrous. We haven't seen a single example of this in history. Oppressive regimes and discriminatory institutions do not decide one day over hummus to relinquish their power. They are forced. They are forced through boycotts, they are forced through international solidarity, and they are forced when their country's legitimacy no longer exists. So let's stop granting our oppressors legitimacy and stop normalizing today.